manipulates and mixes real-world events with fantasy occurrences to create a strange kaleidoscope of history that it places on display for the player. Completely unique, but spotted with dashes of real life, the game works to weave a world individual of ours with its fantasy and sci-fi elements, but parallel in its progression of time, technology, and historic figures. This serves to create a game world that is incredibly immersive and intriguing to players, but it also works to do something that may be so much greater. The setting of Sunless Sea is centered around the city of fallen London, set on the foot of the Untersea, a subterranean ocean ruled by 4 cosmic gods and inhabited by monsters and lost civilizations swallowed by the earth. The game begins in 1887, 26 years after London found itself settled deep in the Neath after Queen Victoria sold her city to 9 otherworldly creatures called the Masters, who now rule London, in exchange for an extension of Prince Albert's life. The player takes on the role of an undersea captain who is seeking fortune on the high seas. The game gives the player incredible agency in influencing trade and world politics as a sea captain. It is this agency that works to have the player taking an active role in forming their Sunless Sea experience as a unique commentary on the effect that maritime trade and industrialization had on British class mobility. In the game, the specific path that the player chooses to reach the status of a captain, ranging from a street urchin to a disgraced priest, affects how fast he or she can rise within society. Story-wise, this influences characters' interactions with various NPCs, which stands for non-player characters, and the main quest line that the player progresses along, but it has no bearing on the ability of the player to gain wealth. In the Victorian age, this would not be the case, as it would be more difficult for someone from a lower social class to go quickly up the social ladder. So Sunless Sea creates an easier way for individuals to move across social classes as players progress through the game. This in particular provides a social commentary against the rigid class structure that was present in the Victorian age, limiting individuals from actually being able to be successful through monetary gains or moving up in one's profession. As players progress through the game, they take on a role closely resembling that of a merchant mariner, gaining wealth and improving the wealth gained on their sea voyages by purchasing new ships and hiring new crew. This provides an easier outlet to move up through the class structure, exemplifying how maritime trade positively impacted individuals' growth in society. As the game is set within the industrial setting of Victorian London, the game also works to establish sailors as more than just men of the sea. Steamships came to be a dehumanizing factor in the sense that less men were needed on the ship, thus undermining the impact of humans while emphasizing the greater impact that technology had in English society. This created a need for unique skill sets not often seen on the waves before this time, as the paper Technical Change in the Wage Structure During the Second Industrial Revolution, Evidence from the Merchant Marine, 1865 to 1912, revealed. The game portrays this seamlessly with the integration of a unique cast of characters that act as a player's officers on the vessel. These officers offer a bonus to players' stats, while also serving as linchpins for much of the game's story. And speaking of story,
much of the player's interactions in the game are centered around the dealings and characters that move the inner workings of London. Though players begin their journey as a lowly captain at the bottom rung of English society, as they travel throughout the Neath acquiring key information and amassing rare treasures, more of London opens up to them. The player's progression launches them into higher social status. Players can go from a lower class citizen renting a room from an inn to owning a manor and becoming the head of a dynasty of sea captains. This class structure of Sunless Sea closely mirrors that of the Victorian era with a couple of fantasy elements. In the article, The Family and Class Structure in Mid-19th Century Europe, the author evaluates the complex hierarchy of fallen London, which is very similar to that of Sunless Sea. At the bottom of Sunless Sea class structure are the clay men and tomb colonists. These two groups constitute this cheap labor that drives much of the economy of the Neath, which closely parallels the lower classes of Victorian England that worked as the cheap manpower in factories. This pattern continues throughout the rest of the game of the working class structures of Sunless Sea, as the game creates alternative versions of the various parts of Victorian social structure. The second most exclusive class of the game, and the one that the player can only interact with as an outsider, is comprised of those favored by the bazaar and the nobles of the Khanate, essentially compromising the English gentry. This depiction shows how in the game, classes were rigid since the mixing of the classes was frowned upon in fallen London. The working class and middle class had very few interactions with nobles and especially the Queen, as stated by Frank Parkin in the Social Analysis of Class Structure, similar to how it was during the Victorian era. Evidently, the game attempts to recreate Victorian class structure in order to present the stark differences present in each class in terms of quality of life and such. The one non-destructive way that the player can ascend to the peak of the social ladder is by establishing a new colony on the sunlit island of Estival and having the rule legitimized by one of the 4 ruling classes of the Neath. While all of these routes serve to show just how impossible it was for one to breach the uppermost crust of society during the Victorian era. The game as a whole demonstrates just how maritime, trade, and industrialism work to open up mobility along the British social ladder. The player is able to navigate to some of the upper rungs of the social ladder by working trade routes and taking advantage of every opportunity that the Z offered. This use of economic power to gain social influence most closely resembles that of maritime trade companies like the East India Company, as well as the British businessmen like Sir Titus Salt, who, according to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biographies, built the largest mill in the world at the time with its own village. Similar to Sir Titus Salt's pursuit of wealth, industrialization promotes a world in sunless sea in which the player can also amass vast amounts of echoes, the game's currency. Though notably lacking an entity like that of the East India Company until the installment of the third game in the series, Sunless Skies, the player still interacts with in-game institutions that operate much in the same way. One of the most indispensable institutions to early game progression is the Admiralty. This office funds early voyages and expeditions in exchange for information that could potentially expand its influence. This interaction with the player is similar to being recruited into the British Merchant Marine Fleet, bringing some realistic elements into this video game. The player can also forego this action and simply find economic success by undertaking voyages that expand economy in different parts of the Reach. Regardless of this choice, the players will find themselves more well off than they were at the beginning of the game. The game attempts to create an alternative version of history by contrasting its relative simplicity of class mobility with the somewhat less rigid class mobility amid the surge of mercantilism in the Victorian era. Sunless Sea exudes the defining characteristics of the steampunk genre as it effectively combines elements of visual design, influenced by the technology introduced during the Industrial Revolution, with Victorian themes such as the dark, gritty atmosphere of London, in order to emphasize how class structure was impacted during this turbulent era. As U.S. historian Don Spring explains in an academic journal article about historical video games, a video game like this transcends traditional forms of historical education by introducing the important element of simulation, which is a way of imitating behavior of a particular situation or process through an analogous mechanism. This puts gamers in the shoes of figures during this historical time periods, allowing gamers to attempt to truly understand how certain events and developments would have impacted their daily lives. As a result, this encourages a higher level of thinking rather than simply reading about the aspects of the time period in the textbook. Incorporating the steampunk genre allows Sunless Sea to have its own unique character and style that results from the combination of past and futuristic elements. Although video games set during the 19th century like Sunless Sea can distort the true ominous and dangerous conditions that resulted from the industrialization of London, they overall manage to properly capture the difficulty of everyday living and class mobility.